So welcome everyone, you've made it to the final podcast in our journey through narrative literature in pre-modern India. In our final readings for the course, we'll be looking at a lovely Sufi romance called Madhumālatī by the Hindavi poet Mir Sayyid Manjhan Rajgiri. And it belongs to a fascinating hybrid genre called premākhyān, in which love stories are allegorized to be Sufi mystical narratives about the ultimate merger with God. Now, as a hybrid poet, Manjhan is able to bring together in really incredible ways two very long-standing and venerable traditions. First, the massive tradition of Sanskrit poetry with its ideas of rasa and figurative imagery, and then the equally venerable tradition of Sufi poetry with its idea of allegory and ultimate union with God. And Manjhan might have thrown in a bit of vernacular bhakti in there as well. Manjhan composed his Madhumālatī in North India in about 1545, so a bit before Tulsi's Ramayana, maybe around the same time as Kabir. But Manjhan was not writing for these bhakti communities, and he wasn't also writing for the Sanskrit courts either. Rather, Manjhan's audiences were the political courts at Bihar, eastern UP, who were operating within a Persianate literary sphere and a religious culture that was centered on various competing orders of Sufi mysticism. Now, in order to appreciate what Manjhan was doing, what I'd like to first do is to go over some, in a very kind of superficial way, some few things that we should know about this Persianate world and Sufi culture. Then we'll look at the structure of what a typical Sufi romance or premākhyān would have looked like, and then we'll dive into the story of Manjhan and his Madhumālatī. So, as we've talked about, new things were starting to happen in the Indian subcontinent in the second millennium. There was the rise of regional vernacular languages, of regional kingdoms, of the Bhakti movement. Then there was the biggest thing of all, maybe, which was the advent of both Persianate political power and Sufi religious culture in the subcontinent. I think it's important to separate these two ideas because too often people kind of conflate them into being the same thing, that Islamic power conquered India and set up the Mughal Empire. It was a much more complicated set of interactions that happened. There was an imposition of Persianate courtly culture, a mapping of Persianate courtly culture into the Indian political courts, and B, there were various Sufi mystical orders that set up camp and began to grow in popularity in the Indian subcontinent. So, let's talk first about the idea of a Persianate courtly culture. The historical setting for this is in the second millennium, and it was a time period of sort of decisive incursions and imperial dominance of rulers that hailed from outside of India, from Turkish backgrounds, Persian, Afghan backgrounds. It's a complicated history again, but we can maybe boil it down into two distinct phases. Phase one was a period of the regional sultanates, and it began with kind of these annual raids of the Ghaznavid rulers from Khorasan region of Afghanistan, starting in the thousands ADs. Eventually, the raiders began to establish permanent kingdoms in the subcontinent. These were the sultanates over the various regions, like the Delhi Sultanate, the Gujarat, Bahmani Sultanate, and so on. Right? Most of these leaders were of Turkish origin or Afghan origin or Persian descent, and they conducted their palace affairs in the language of Persian. Eventually, a new player kind of came into the picture, the Mughals, who were cousins of the Mongol rulers of the Central Asian plains and in China. And these Mughals established their empire in Delhi starting in 1526 and went on until the British formally took over India in 1857. So life in this period, in these two phases, was distinctly divided into different settings. You had the public marketplace, the bazaar, and then there was the royal court, the elite court. In the bazaar, you would hear multiple different languages based on where you were, right? But in the courts of the sultanates, you would have heard Persian. A lot of different cultural elements were all came along with this language of Persian. Remember, it's Persian plus a bunch of other stuff. This included modes of art and architecture, music, amusements and pastimes, gardens, ways of dressing, eating, drinking, even the way you sit. So much of what it meant to be civilized and elite in the court, which had previously been shaped by Sanskrit courtly culture, now gets reshaped by Persianate courtly culture that's being informed by courts outside of India, so that courts in India started to look a lot like courts in Persia, in Baghdad, Istanbul, maybe even Venice to some extent. Right? So just like there used to be a Sanskrit cosmopolis that stretched from Afghanistan to Bali in the first millennium, you could now imagine a new cosmopolis stretching from Istanbul to Delhi, where all the elite classical literature and intellectual expression took place not in local languages so much, but in Persian. So the courtly poets were writing a new kind of poetry, but they didn't give up the old forms of poetry that they were used to. So instead, what we see is a kind of hybridized aesthetics, where Sanskrit and vernacular literary sensibilities, like the ideas of rasa and bhakti, get intermingled with conventions that are being taken from Persian literature and poetry. And the big idea from Persian that they get is the idea of religious allegory. Culture gets hybridized in another way as well. Persian language gets blended together with local vernacular languages to create new kind of courtly hybrid languages, sometimes called Hindavi. These also have regional variations. So Dakkani is the Deccani Hindavi, Awadhi is in eastern India, and so on. Hindavi writings became popular because they were more accessible maybe to the wider mainstream public who wouldn't have naturally learnt Persian. So there's a kind of Persian and Hindavi duality in the courtly scene. Eventually the idea is that Hindavi grew and developed into Hindi and Urdu in the modern period. The other side of the Persianate courtly culture is a religious one. The poets who were writing in Persian or Hindavi were motivated by various important Sufi orders around the country, and these Sufi orders were based at shrines around India, which provided a kind of spiritual and intellectual training ground for the general public, as well as inspiring these poets. So let's talk a bit about what Sufism was and is, and how it came to take hold in medieval India. It's a massive subject. I can't possibly do it justice, but the idea is let's just get a basic knowledge of what was going on, so that when we read Manjhan, we get a better appreciation of his Madhumālatī. So Sufism involves distinct spiritual or mystical paths within within Islamic religion, known as tariqas. And these paths would consist of unbroken chains, known as a silsila, between masters and disciples, right, going down, through which the idea was that the grace of God, the barakat, gets passed down from us from the time of the Prophet Muhammad. The Sufi spiritual masters, these masters are known as sheikhs, and the various the orders of the Sufi mystical tradition gets organized around these sort of foundational sheikhs. So what do people who belong to a particular Sufi order actually do in their lives, right? Well, a member of an order is known as a seeker or a salik, which literally means a traveler who gets initiated into a particular order of a particular sheikh, and then after initiation he goes through all kinds of lifelong forms of spiritual training, different kinds of prayer, fasting, sermons, songs, dance, all kinds of vows and regimens. And his whole ambition is to try to reach that ultimate destination, the final destination of the journey, which is to join with God and experience his ecstatic love. This idea of Sufism initially seems to have grown up in the Middle East in its contact with Persia, starting in the early second millennium. These various Sufi sheikhs traveled to India and set up Sufi orders in the Indian subcontinent, and then began to establish what are known as vilayats, or spiritual domains. Right? These spiritual domains in India had a kind of intricate relationship with the Persianate courts of the subcontinent. So on the one side, they gained patronage and financial support, right, from sultans and Mughals later. But at the same time, the Sufi saints also gave a measure of religious legitimacy and authority to the political courts as well. So it was a sort of dance that they played. These Sufi orders were based at the tombs and other memorial shrines of important Sufi leaders, and you can find them all over the subcontinent. These are known as dargahs. The dargahs served as cultural centers. They still do, in fact. They serve as cultural centers that sort of were the public counterparts of the political courts in some ways. These were sites of Sufi literary output and all kinds of knowledge production, actually, including law, astronomy, mathematics, engineering, and of course, religious theology, and so on. These were also sites of Islamic ritual practices, and also, quite importantly, sites where Islam was performed in India. So just like we saw how bhakti really took off in the public, right, through song, music, dance, and other performance, Islam also takes hold in India through various forms of music, song, dance, like the qawwali, which would take place at these Sufi shrines. It still does. So that's the new kind of cultures that took hold in the Indian subcontinent in the second millennium: Persian literary culture in the elite political courts, Sufi religious culture in the public domain of the dargahs. An interesting genre of poetry that arises from these two different traditions appearing in South Asia is known as the premākhyān, or the Sufi romance. So let's take a look about and see what this was before specifically turning to Madhumālatī. The word premākhyān literally means a love story. Premākhyān, and it's a genre of Sufi romantic narrative that was told in Hindavi, which is the vernacular, kind of Persianate vernacular of UP and Madhya Pradesh, basically North India. The word premākhyān itself is from Sanskrit, actually. The word prem meaning love, akhyan meaning narrative or story. So it has certainly clear inspiration from the older Sanskrit forms of poetry, but it's also modeled on the Persian tradition of storytelling tradition of the Masnavi, a popular romance that was spreading orally into India from Persia at the same time. So it's a fused genre. It takes cues from Sanskrit literature and the ideas, especially of rasa aesthetics. It takes cues from elite Persian literature, popular Sufi spiritual ideas, and maybe a bit of bhakti ethos as well from the streets and the bazaars of medieval India. It's kind of a poetry for the times in which it was written. Aditya Behel, who really was the world's authority on premākhyān and who passed away way, way too young, he understood the premākhyān as operating on a poetics of prem, or romantic love, as distinguishable from a poetics of rasa that we saw in Sanskrit poetry, and especially that erotic poetry that's involved. That involves Shrungara, right? It's also distinct from what we've been looking at for the last couple of weeks, the poetics of bhava, which is the directly experienced forms of love that we're supposed to feel for ourselves in bhakti. Instead, the poetics of prem in the premākhyān operates on the key underlying principle of allegory. The story itself is on the surface a story about human love, ishq-i majazi, but for the sensitive Sufi reader, it's a thoroughly suggestive narrative about the spiritual love between man and God, ishq-i hakiki. Right? Rasa, if you remember, also involved a sublimation of emotion, so that in a poem you get to experience an as-if kind of love. But that as-if love is still between a man and a woman. Here we're supposed to understand that it's really about the love between man and God, and the kind of and the quest towards ultimate merger between those two entities. So premākhyāns are allegorical and they follow a typical plot line. Maybe you could compose your own premākhyān if you wanted. And here's the plot of any premākhyān. It has 4 stages, basically. They all start with a Sufi formal prologue that pays homage to God, to the sheikhs, the spiritual teachers. Then the story itself has 3 parts. First, there's an initial burst of erotic desire, of kama between a hero and heroine. Right? Then, due to various circumstances, there's a period of separation or viraha between our 2 lovers, and a long series of struggles that'll try to get them back together. Right? Then finally, there's an ultimate union between the 2, but now what they feel towards one another is a higher kind of love, prem, that's different from the erotic kama that they had earlier experienced. These 3 steps, desire, separation, satisfaction, is supposed to be allegorical of the mystical process that a salik, a seeker, goes through in his or her quest to find God. First, the seeker has an awakening where you get a taste of what the divine really is. Then the seeker goes through a series of purifications and illuminations inside himself or herself, and with the help of a spiritual guide. Ultimately, the Sufi seeker reaches God, has that final blissful union, and experiences a permanent state of satisfaction, of prem. With this structure in mind, let's turn to our author of the week, right, Manjhan, and how he constructed his Madhumālatī along the same allegorical plotline. Manjhan, his full name was Mir Sayyid Manjhan Rajgiri. He was from the town of Rajgir in Bihar. He got trained by a sheikh named Muhammad Ghaus Gwaliari from the Shaktari order of Sufis. This shrine is located in Gwalior in Madhya Pradesh. After getting his training, Manjhan seems to have gotten work as a court poet in a small court in Bihar of the Afghan ruler Salim Shah. And in 1545, this is when he composes Madhumālatī. It's in Hindavi, which is basically the same as Avadhi. Avadhi was, remember, the language of Tulsidas's Ramayana, right? Hindavi is maybe a more Persianized version of the same language. You can think of it that way. The story itself involves 2 pairs of love stories intertwined. There's the story of Prince Manohar and a princess named Madhumālatī. At the same time, there's also a story of their guides, Pema and Tarachand. Hopefully we'll talk about it a bit more. The whole story is soaked through with Sufi allegory, but also with rasa that you'll recognize, and a heavy dosage of kind of bhakti ideas as well. So here's how the story goes, and it's going to be kind of complicated, right? First, it begins with a prologue that offers prayers to God and explains the context of why Manjhan is writing his poem. And then we find the first phase, the moment of desire or kama. We get the description of the birth of Prince Manohar, and then when he's 14 years old, a group of celestial nymphs come and take him from his bed and magically transport him to the bedroom of the beautiful Princess Madhumālatī. The 2 youngsters fall in love with each other at first sight. They actually start hooking up, sort of physically getting it on. But then the nymphs get a bit alarmed at this, kind of going too far, and take Manohar back home. He wakes up filled with longing for Madhumālatī and decides to abandon his home, turn into a yogi renunciant, and find Madhumālatī. This is the long period of separation, or viraha, allegorical to the journey of the Sufi seeker. All kinds of adventures happen to Manohar. There's a shipwreck. He meets and rescues another beautiful princess named Pema from a demon tiger. Her name, Pema, is of course derived from prema. Then Pema initially falls in love with Manohar, her rescuer, but after he explains what his quest is, she kind of puts her love aside and helps him reunite with Madhumālatī, and they hook up again. This time the 2 of them actually have sex. But then there's more separation. Madhumālatī's mother catches them and turns her own daughter angrily, kind of magically, into a bird. Now the narrative shifts lenses to Madhumālatī and her quest. She flies around suffering in love for Manohar, trying to find him. Eventually she gets caught by a prince named Tarachand, who also falls in love with her. But then when he learns about her quest, He helps reconcile her with her mother. The mother changes her back to a human. Then the story enters phase 3 of union and this development of prem. Right? Manohar and Madhumālatī get reunited, they get married, they have a formal consummation of their love. The two assistants, Tarachand and Pema, who had foregone their own sort of erotic impulses, they're married to one another, and the two couples then go home to their respective kingdoms. So that's the story, full of kind of fascinating scenes of eroticism, romance, adventure, family drama, maybe pretty much like a Bollywood movie. I don't know, if you ask me. Maybe these kinds of stories are, in fact, roots of some of your favorite, blockbusters. But at the same time, they're also intricate tales that tell you the story of the Sufi search for ultimate divine union, above and beyond the kind of worldly pleasures and problems that we're all perpetually caught up in. So let's crack open our books sort of one last time, read some passages, and see how Manjhan masterfully weaves together this premākhyān. See